Klee is currently Genshin Impact's most clunky character, and throughout my time of filming this video, I've had the most miserable experience playing her. The reasoning is quite simple. The effort to play this character isn't worth the reward tied to such effort, coupled with all the other on-field pyro characters currently in Genshin Impact. There's zero reason as to why this character should ever see any play in any content. Have it so bad, this character at the time of her arrival was already dead on arrival due to her being worse than a standard banner 5-star that competed with the same role as her. Yo, what up, Toshi here? We're bringing back the Genshin Impact historical analysis series. In today's video, we'll be taking a deep dive into the history of Genshin Impact's most clunky limited character, Klee. The main damage dealers would eventually find their way into the early meta, abusing the best offensive and defensive supports. The most popular choice for the more in-game meta-focused players would be those that synergize well with the elemental reactions in the game. For the time being, Vaporize. Diluc would rise as the premium pyro main damage dealer for those that were lucky or unlucky depending on your perspective. Xiangling would be given to the player for free at a certain point in the game, and while being a character that spent barely any time on field, would still be utilized for her synergy with Xingqiu for the Vaporize damage amplification. This Xiangling bit might not make much sense given that Diluc and later on Klee were on-field pyro damage dealers, but I promise her standing will make a lot more sense later on. This Vaporize meta would carry on with the help of Bennett for his amazing attack buff, pyro resonance buff, energy, and early pyro swirl with min-maxing rotations. And of course, the last slot being reserved for the Anemo character with Resist Shred for mostly just the pyro element. No other elemental reaction and teaming comp at the time could really compensate with this style of play, and this heavy Vaporize meta was though to reach even further heights with the release of Klee in the second half of the 1.0 patch. Klee, being the pyro limited character she was, meant that expectations were already extremely high. Diluc already had an overwhelming presence in the late game meta, and Xiangling was given to the player for free early enough. If we were to lastly take into consideration that the previous limited banner character, Venti, literally broke the game upon his arrival, a lot of pressure was put onto Klee to perform. Right off the bat, this character had one thing going for her: he was adorable. Considering this is a historical analysis video, being cute unfortunately doesn't translate too well to higher usage in the endgame, at least long term. Well, Klee's gameplay was a lot more different than the traditional Diluc combo attack string, and while Klee had off-field capabilities like Xiangling, she required much more field time as a result of her kit design. So let's break it down. Klee's kit design felt like a mix of on-field and off-field, which isn't of course the end of the world. Klee's basic and charge attacks are targeted while also having a long animation string between her attacks. Luckily for Klee, these attacks can trigger the Vaporize effect to increase her overall damage. The elemental skill of the character is a sort of skill shot that can actually miss enemies with the initial hit, but still eventually explodes and drops individual bombs that do more damage on impact. Now, Klee's attacks, including the bombs, each apply their own pyro to whoever is hit, and in order for the attacks to trigger the Vaporize effect, there would need to be the same amount of Hydro applied and more to the enemy. But given the many infused pyro attacks of Klee and the inconsistency of landing them would make this a mess to play with around. So Klee's main source of damage as a main DPS pyro character should be centered around the Vaporize reaction, and with the launch artifact set created and pyro characters in mind, she would miss out on half of the bonuses that the set would provide, hindering a portion of her overall DPS. This weird kit was a huge miss for miHoYo overall, and with the synergy she had with Venti, things got ever so worse. Much like the not so recent history of Venti video, we discussed the shortcomings of Venti's kit when being utilized by Klee. However, a refresher is overdue. Klee, for one, has anti-synergy alongside Venti for the fact that her elemental skill bombs do not take advantage of the AoE suck provided by Venti's ultimate. This means that the enemies grouped by Venti miss out on a huge source of AoE damage with the Dodo bombs provided by Klee. And with the swirl pyro resonance shred Venti also gave, the damage loss was even bigger. That's not to say that the two couldn't work together, and this wombo combo would later be made up with the release of another Anemo user, Venti being the first limited character introduced into the game, and the best support the game could offer throughout all stages of the game. that a lot of launch players had has zero synergy with the second limited character Klee. This will dogpile onto the reasons as to why Klee was a more often than not skipped character for the meta-centric player. Diluc was just another part in that equation. With there being no good options to use alongside Klee, this character would quickly become one of the worst characters in the game. Oppa Shengling was given to the player for free, and Diluc was a standard 5-star you could obtain through the gacha or reroll method. This would mean the only single use case of this character would be for whales, and I kid you not, it was due to a rare damage amplification Klee provided via constellations, Defense Shred. Alongside Mona, Klee could provide a massive damage boost for screenshot damage with her 4th constellation, and this would of course give her a weird niche for the whales that wanted a dopamine fix. It's also very nice for YouTube thumbnails if I'm being honest here. If you weren't a YouTuber nor a whale, you had no business investing into this character, because she was and currently remains as the epitome of high effort for low reward, if you were to play her in the most optimal way with her animation cancels. This again just wasn't what the average player wanted to do, and when I make these videos, I take into account those same average players that regularly play the game, not the casual players that have no idea that Klee isn't even meta or not. Now I don't mean to doom and gloom throughout this whole video, but Klee truly is the only character in Genshin Impact that hasn't had any relevance in the meta of any form. I mean, there has never been any Hydro character that can keep up with the pyro application she provides, and there wasn't a venti that could synergize with her ability-based damage in the form of the Dodo bombs. All of this would of course remain true until the later release of Kazuha in the patch 1.6, and this would honestly be the first indirect buff Klee was to receive. Kazuha essentially did everything better than Venti did, while not providing a useless stat to Klee like Sucrose did. Elemental Mastery is most definitely not useless, but it certainly has anti-synergy with Klee's overwhelming pyro application. This would mean that the buffs Kazuha provided in the form of elemental damage boost would give more ceiling damage for Klee's many sources of damage. Kazuha, unlike Venti, could also group the Dodo bombs Klee outputted with his suction on the elemental skill, essentially overtaking his already volatile spot in Klee's team composition. At this point, with the many sources of pyro Klee provided, because in the context of Kazuha, you're bound to use the full extent of Klee's kit to maximize the buffs and utility provided by Kazuha's kit, there would never be talks about a potential Hydra candidate for Klee. It just wouldn't ever happen at this point. Klee's short rise and relevancy would later become more prevalent with the release of Yoimiya in 2.5. And it might make no sense at first hearing this, but let me explain to those of you that are unaware. Alongside the release of Yoimiya would feature a weapon banner that was present with the limited weapon for Yai, Kagura's Verity. This catalyst not only gave an elemental skill damage increase to the equipped user, but the criteria for stacking the buffs was doing damage with said elemental skill, which Klee had 2 charges of. Once the user had 3 stacks, they would also gain a sizable damage boost to all sources of their damage, which would give Klee a huge spike in ceiling damage. I also did not forget the fat critical damage main stat of this weapon, which also was very competitive to the current weapon choices of Klee. One was a standard 5-star catalyst that was dependent on massive RNG to obtain because of the many present 5-star weapons and characters on the standard banner, and the other one was an event weapon that was present during the event of Klee's release, and this weapon can no longer be obtained. This may be subject to change, but at this point I don't really want to get your hopes up. This weapon, Dodo tells, would be the signature weapon of Klee, and actually had synergy with the character aside from matching her aesthetic as well. The release of Kagura's Verity would be the second biggest indirect buff this character would ever receive, and to be honest, this should be the end of Klee's history. If we take into account, Klee now has a best in slot offensive buffing animal user that synergizes with her kit, and a best in slot 5-star weapon. There's nothing else this character could receive that would buff her kit as much while being a reasonable ass within the means of miHoYo, because a Hydro applicator on the level of Klee's pyro would just never happen. So with nothing in sight that would give Klee any relevance in Genshin Impact, he would pretty much fade into obscurity, and every later release of on-field pyro damage dealers would make that more and more prominent. In patch 3.8, Klee would receive a 4-star skin with no impact of course to her relevancy in the meta, which makes sense of course. Even at this point, it's unknown how profitable the skin was for Hoyoverse, because there was a very small user base dedicated to this character after all. It's also a paid skin, so free-to-play Klee mains are already gatekept anyways. The skin genuinely looks adorable, but if I'm being honest, Klee's default skin is just iconic and one of the better defaults this game made alongside Hu Tao. But this is just my unwarranted opinion after all. Fast forward to the present day of Arlecchino and now Mavuika wreaking havoc in the vaporized meta of pyro characters, and Klee truly has no place in the game. If we're being honest here, the only time Klee is brought up, which has to do with the curiosity and desire around Alice's inevitable release, who is the mother Klee. A lot of dedicated Genshin players are waiting for her, and I'm most certainly one of them. So who knows why Klee's kit design even made it to the live service in its current iteration. I can say for certain this was the worst limited release of any character in Genshin Impact. At least some of the controversial picks in today's release of Genshin Impact at least have some use cases. The only use case this blonde elf has is giving me stress-induced hair loss with how frustrating she is to use at an optimal level. That's it. Thank you for watching and have a nice rest of your day.